Hello everyone. In this video, let's review the snapping and locking options that are available in the Flexi tools of the Bezier Toolkit. Most of these options are newly added in the recent version, and the functionality is more or less the same for all three tools, that is Flexi Draw Bezier, Flexi Edit Bezier and the Flexi Grease Bezier tool. I'll illustrate the functionality taking just one tool, and if there are any differences in the implementation based on the tool, I'll just clarify that during the course of this video. If you have not yet seen the earlier tutorial videos about the Bezier Toolkit, I would recommend that you watch them first before continuing with this video. Firstly, let's quickly review the three snapping options that were covered in the earlier video. The first one was snap to grid. So if I hold down Control key, the drawing point will be snapped to the grid. And this applies to the handle as well as the Bezier point. The second option was snap to the endpoints of the existing Bezier curves in the scene. So if I hold down Alt key, I can snap to the endpoints of the Bezier. This is now extended to also include the snapping to the other points on the Bezier curve. And the third snapping option was snap to fixed angle increment. So if I start the curve from here and if I hold down the Shift key, the segment that I am drawing will have fixed angle increment with respect to the global x-axis. In the new snapping framework, these options are now also available in Flexi Edit Bezier. And to facilitate the snapping, there is also an option of grabbing provided. So you can either drag the mouse pointer to move the point, or you can double click the point and it will be grabbed, and you can simply move the mouse to shift the point. After grabbing, you can also have the snapping options. For example, after I have grabbed this point, I can hold down Control and this point will be snapped to the grid. Or I can hold down Shift and the segment will move in fixed angle increments with respect to the global x-axis. Or I can hold down Alt and snap the point to the Bezier points or the handle points of the selected Bezier splines. And also now, whenever you are drawing or editing, the status bar in the header of the viewport will show the exact distance between the 2 points in terms of all 3 axes as well as the actual distance. Now let's see the important elements of the snapping and locking framework of the Flexi tools. To illustrate the functionality properly, I have 3 viewports open here. On the right side, I have top orthographic view and front orthographic view, and on the left there is the user perspective view. And since this framework will also be drawing its own set of axes, I'll just hide the x and y axis in the perspective view just to avoid the confusion. Now it's possible to lock the new point being drawn to a single plane or even a single axis. To make the point being drawn coplanar with the earlier point, you just need to press a hotkey. For example, if I am drawing this curve and I want the next point to be in the XY plane of the earlier point, I can press Shift Z. And you can see in the front orthographic view that this new point will always be in the XY plane of the earlier point. Before drawing each point, I am pressing Shift Z here. And in the same way, I can make the new points lie in the XZ plane, let's say, by pressing Shift Y. So you can see in the top view that all these points are actually coplanar. It's even possible to lock the points to a single axis. For example, if I want to draw lines parallel to x-axis, then I can press X and all these lines will be parallel to the global x-axis. Similarly, I can press Y to make the lines parallel to y-axis and so on. After I have started drawing the segment and I press X, then the new point will be locked to the x-axis from its current position. If you know beforehand that all the segments that you are drawing will need to be coplanar, then instead of pressing hotkey before each point, you can simply select a constraint axis option. So whenever you select any of the Flexi tools, there will now be a new set of options in the header portion. One of them is constraint axis, and if I select the constraining axis as XY, then whatever drawing I do will always lie in a plane that will be parallel to the global XY plane. You can see it here in the front orthographic view. This XY plane is currently global XY plane because I have selected global axis as the orientation, but this will change depending on the selections in these two drop downs. We'll see the options in these two drop downs in detail a little later. And if I want the new segments to be in a plane that is not just parallel to the XY plane, but it is actually the XY global plane, then I can select this snap to plane option, and you will see in the front orthographic view that the drawing pointer is locked to this global XY plane. So everything that I do will happen in this plane itself. And I can decide the position of this locking plane by moving the 3D cursor. For example, let's say I want the XY plane to lie here. Then I can move the 3D cursor here to this location, and in the origin drop down select the 3D cursor location. Select this snap to plane option, and now whatever drawing I do will be in this new plane. It's even possible to draw lines that are snapped to a plane and are parallel to an axis. To do that, I need to select the plane axis here. Let's draw lines in XZ plane of the 3D cursor. I select this option, snap to plane, and now if I press X, then the lines that I draw will not only be parallel to the X-axis, but they will lie in the plane of the 3D cursor. Similarly, I can draw lines parallel to Z-axis within the plane by pressing Z. And if I want to draw lines parallel to Y, I need to choose a plane that has Y-axis and then press Y to draw such lines. In precision modeling, we often have the exact values of the new location, and the new framework also allows entering these exact values via keyboard. So let's say I start the curve from the origin and I want the next point at the location 10, 10, 0. Then after starting the curve, I can simply start typing the numbers. So if I say 10 now, you can see in the status bar, the delta X value is 10. To set the Y value, I need to press tab and again enter the value. I'll enter the value 10, and to confirm I can press spacebar or enter. So this will define the next point. Similarly, if I want, I can define the handle location also, and if I want the straight line, I can simply hit the spacebar once again here and continue drawing the curve. Just remember that the values we are entering are in this case with reference to the global origin, and the orientation will be global axis. So if I want the next point to lie at a distance of 10 along x-axis with respect to the earlier one, I'll need to enter the value as 20 for x-axis and 10 for y-axis. It's even possible to tweak the location of the new point through the keyboard. So while drawing, if I know that the point is tentatively in this area, but I want to round off the value, so I can just press P here. So the location will be frozen at this point, and I can tweak the values via keyboard. So let's say I put dx as 10, dy as 6, and dz as 3. The entering through keyboard is very similar to how you will enter the values when you transform the object in Blender. Additionally, if the segment is restricted to a single plane, then you can enter the coordinates in Cartesian form or polar form. The first time I press P, I can enter the value in Cartesian form, and if I press P again, I can enter the value in the form of polar coordinates, that is the length and the angle of the segment with the x-axis. So let's change the value of the length to, let's say, 20, and let's have angle as exactly 45 degrees. Just remember that entering the polar coordinates is available only when there is exactly a pair of axes selected in constraining axis dropdown. And also the values that I enter here will be interpreted based on the selections in these two drop-down boxes. Currently I have the orientation as global axis and the origin as global. So whatever values I enter will be with reference to the global origin and the angle will be with respect to the first axis in the axis pair. And just to reiterate, this snapping and locking framework is available in all three Flexi tools. So for example, if I am editing this curve and I grab this point by double clicking it, I can enter the new location of this point via keyboard. Or for example, if I select this option of snapping to plane and grab a point on the curve by double clicking it, this point will always lie on the XY plane, as can be seen in the front orthographic view. Let's see the other options in origin drop-down. We have already seen global origin and 3D cursor location. We can also set the origin to the active object location if it's available. So let me just add a plane and I'll move this plane to some other location. Now the values that you see in the status bar are relative to the location of this plane. And if I enter now the values through keyboard, let's say 10, this 10 will be relative to again the location of the active object. And to understand this option, reference line point, let's first see what exactly the reference line is. The connotation of reference line will differ with the context. For example, when I am drawing the curve, then this reference line means the segment that is being drawn, or to be more precise, the line joining the two ends of the segment. Very often we need to manipulate the next segment with respect to the previous segment. So in such cases, this particular option, reference line point, is quite handy. Let's say I start the curve from here and I have drawn the first segment and I want now the next point to be located exactly at a horizontal distance of 10 units from the earlier point. So instead of now calculating the point location in terms of global coordinates, I can simply choose the origin as reference line point and type 10. So this 10 is actually relative to the end point of the earlier segment. Similarly, I can also set the y value relative to the earlier point and so on. When we are editing a curve, the reference line for a Bezier point would mean actually the line that is joining that particular Bezier point with the adjacent Bezier point. So in this case, if I move this point by 10 while keeping the origin as a reference line point, this 10 is relative to the earlier Bezier point. Whereas in case of the handle, the reference line is actually the handle itself and the reference line point is the other point of the handle. So if I now type 10, this 10 is relative to this particular point. For the point on Bezier curve, the reference line is the line forming the new location of the point and the previous location of the point, that is the location of the point from where I started editing it. So this way I can easily enter the values in terms of relative shift of the point. So for example, I can shift this point from its current location by a value of, let's say, 5 units towards the left on x-axis just by typing it. We'll see this option custom axis start after we have discussed the different orientations. Setting this origin is basically a means of letting the tool know the point from which it should do the transformations and also for defining the exact constraint axis location as we saw. With the orientation, I basically let the tool know the line relative to which it should calculate the angles, because every time it's not convenient to have the global axis as the reference for setting the angles. So just like the origin, we have the flexibility of setting the orientation as well. We have already seen the global axis orientation. So let's say I hold down shift and move the mouse cursor. The angle that I am snapping to is relative to the global axis. Or if I am entering the polar coordinate values, the theta that is mentioned here refers to actually the theta with respect to the global axis. Now if we change this to, let's say, view, this angle will always be with respect to the current view. For instance, if I now hold down shift, the angle increments will always be with respect to the view itself. Or if I now type the polar coordinates, the angle will be with respect to the view axis. Also, if I say reference axis as XY, when the orientation is view, the XY plane that is considered for locking the drawing or editing is the view XY plane. Next, if we change the orientation to, let's say, active object, and there exists an active object in the scene, then the local space of this active object will be taken as the reference for determining the locking planes and axis and angle values. Let me add a plane and rotate it slightly. Now this plane will serve as the reference point for orienting the curve being drawn. So you can see in the front orthographic view, this curve is entirely within the plane of this plane object. Or if I hold down Shift key and snap the angle, then this angle will be with respect to the local space of the active object. This can be quite useful when we want to create the Bezier curves on a plane, for example. Next, if I choose the reference line as the orientation, let me also set the origin as the reference line point so that it is easier to understand. So now at every point while drawing, the orientation will change and it will be determined by the previous point. So for example, I can set the angle with reference to the earlier point, or if I set this value to, let's say, XZ, the points that I am drawing will all be perpendicular to each other. Or I can enter the angle values, for example the polar coordinates, which is with respect to the earlier point. And remember, the primary axis for finding out the angle is the first one in the axis pair. And lastly, let's see the options related to the custom axis. Custom axis in very simple terms is a line that provides a new set of orientation and origin for the Flexi tools. I can create the custom axis when one of the Flexi tools is selected and the origin is custom axis start. I essentially define the two endpoints of the custom axis. While creating this line, I can use almost all the snapping options. So I can snap to the grid and I need to right click and release the button and move the pointer to the desired location. For confirming the line, I right click once again, and now this is the custom axis along which I can orient all my new curves. And if there are already existing curves, of course you can snap to the Bezier points to create the custom axis. In Flexi Edit Bezier, I can also snap to the Bezier handles, for example. And whenever I am defining the custom axis, I can use the mouse wheel to additionally define the custom snapping points. Maybe I'll create a separate video on this. Currently, just let's focus on the use of the custom axis in the locking framework. So after I have defined the custom axis, I can use it as my orientation axis. I have chosen custom axis in orientation and I have chosen custom axis start in the origin. That's why we have the origin at the beginning of the custom axis. The direction of the custom axis is important. The starting point has a brighter shade and the color fades off as the line ends. Now I have all the options that are available with the other orientations with the custom axis orientation. So for example, I can snap to the plane of this custom axis. I can change this to, let's say, YZ, and this curve will lie in a plane perpendicular to the custom axis. Lastly, let's see this option also, axis scale. This option is available when the orientation is either reference line or it is custom axis. If I check this option and let's say I have orientation as custom axis, then I can use the scale of the custom axis. The entire length of the custom axis is 10 units on the scale. So now if I set 10 while drawing the curve, then this 10 is actually the end point of the custom axis. To understand it better, let me change the origin to reference line point. So now if I say 10, this value of 10 is exactly of the length of the custom axis. Or if I say, let's say 15, this is exactly 1.5 times the length of the custom axis. And I can of course use it for all the axes. So when I say y as 15, this 15 is actually 1.5 times the total length of the custom axis. This option can be very useful when you want to model something which has segments with endpoints separated by distance that is exact multiple of some number. This will be even clearer if I change this to reference line. With the orientation changed to reference line, and if I check the axis scale option, then while drawing the curve, the previous segment will serve as the scaling reference. So in this particular example, the length of this segment will represent exactly 10 units. So if I now type 10, the point will move exactly by the same amount of length as the previous segment length along the reference line x-axis. And I can of course set the y value as well. Let's set this to 5. And again this 5 means half the length of the previous segment. So the new segment is exactly the same amount of length as the previous segment on x-axis and half the length of the previous segment on y-axis. And similarly, the new segment that I am drawing will have the segment length with reference to the earlier segment. So this 5 on y-axis represents half the length of the previous segment. I can of course set the length of the handle also the same way. That's it about the new snapping and locking framework of the Flexi tools. I hope you find these options useful. There are a lot of things to explore, so you can play around with these options. And when you get accustomed, I think you will really enjoy it. There have been many things added since the last release, so it's possible that you come across some defects while using this functionality. If you do, then please share the defect details in the comment section or on the issues section of the GitHub page. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until next time.